is Lisa Pena. I'm a lecturer at Arizona State University at their design school under the Visual Communication Design program. Today, I've collaborated with my colleague Mukesh Patel to bring you a lecture on semiotics in communication design. We're sorry we can't be there, but we hope you enjoy it. If you would, take a moment to think about how you arrived for today's presentation. I believe you gathered here thanks to one symbol, a simple shape that provides meaning in our everyday lives, and perhaps one that we take for granted. Yet it does its job effectively and efficiently. What is this symbol? An arrow. As you journey to convene today, you most likely followed an arrow. Whether it directed you across a street, down a hall, or to your seat. An arrow is a semiotic component that has been accepted and adopted all over the world by multiple cultures to signify various actions and meanings. It has historic reference as well. Think back to a bow and arrow, used for hunting or warfare. Or what about arrowheads, used by ancient civilizations and ancestors? It also has ties to archery. Additionally, an arrow packs quite a bit of meaning. It can represent different ideas, such as direction, protection, and friendship, to name a few. But how does this story of an arrow tie back to semiotics? In order to understand that, we need to first find out who Charles Sanders Peirce was. He is an American who defined semiotics as the formal study of signs. He was interested in the relationship between context and meaning, as well as the emotion or reactions that could come from said relationship. He broke semiotics into three components, or you could say three methods of representation. They are symbolic, iconic, and indexical. Symbolic. This is something that is learned, something that's agreed upon by society, such as letters, numbers, shapes, and even colors. Iconic. This is a direct and literal representation. It looks like what it represents. Some examples are an arrow, tree, man, woman, a car, and so on. An indexical representation is indirect. It hints at something, a clue that makes connections to provide meaning. So when we see smoke, we know there's a fire. When we see footprints, we know people have been through a certain area. And when we see a fingerprint, we know we can tie it back to a person. These three can be independent of one another or mixed to collaboratively tell a story. Semiotics allows the viewer to learn and interpret the meanings based on different aspects such as color, typeface, placement, and imagery. As designers, we tend to produce iconic representations often. However, it is an indexical representation that is the most interesting, as they require the viewer to decipher the meaning being portrayed. My third-year visual communication design students are challenged to produce a semiotic poster series in order to enhance their understanding of semiotics. Using a narrative that is no more than 15 words, they must provide a symbolic, iconic, and indexical representation. The narrative chosen can be a quote, lyric, poem, or self-written story. Students must take typeface, color, imagery, scale, placement, and space into consideration, as all of these impact meaning. Let's look at a few to understand how semiotics plays a role in communication design. We begin with a lyric from a song. "I'm out here on my own, I might not come back home," by Beach Fossils. Here, we see the students' semiotic poster series as it relates to that narrative. On the left is symbolic, in the middle is iconic, and on the right is indexical. If we look at symbolic, we see that the student provided a narrative using written word. Again, this ties back to what we said is something learned, such as the alphabet. In iconic, he was literal to the lyrics by showing an individual in the middle of nowhere. Their back is turned to the audience, as this man clearly tries to determine his next move. For indexical, we see the same desert landscape, but now the man is gone, and all that is left behind are his footprints. These prints are the clue that tells us that he has determined his next move and traveled to a different place, even if we don't understand where that final destination is. Notice the colors of the posters and how they're the same, as is the placement of the type. This was done to create a unified, cohesive look to the visual story. Our next series also uses lyrics from a song. Let's take a look at how it was visually translated. The story is, "I have never known hunger like these insects that feast on me," by Hosier. Once again, symbolic consists of the narrative depicted using letters to form words. This ties back to our understanding that symbolic uses a learned method. For iconic, we see a literal translation of the story. Through illustration, we see a hand half exposed, half buried in the ground. The color of the skin informs us that this hand belongs to someone who is deceased, and we see that insects are descending on it to feast. For indexical, we see the hand has been replaced by exposed bone and new flora. This hints that what was once there is gone, and the remnants left behind are the only clue that it once existed. This student chose a movie quote from the film Forrest Gump. "Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you are gonna get," by Winston Groom. As you can see by now, the symbolic representation is consistently represented by letter forms. This will continue with the examples that follow. Since iconic is a literal representation, the student chose to show chocolates. These ones are cracked open in some cases. They did so as to hint back to the "you never know what you're gonna get" line in the narrative, and to be literal as to what that is and trying to figure out what's inside. But they couldn't show just an empty box of chocolates for indexical, because that would have too many ties to iconic as well. So for indexical, the student chose to show a torn candy wrapper. It hints that the chocolates have been unwrapped and most likely consumed. Unlike the previous examples, this one is a poem that was written by a friend of the student. "If my love for you was sweet honey, I could bottle it up." Sophia Truscott. The narrative is represented with letter forms to meet the criteria of symbolic representation. For iconic, we see the meaning of the story represented with an expectant mother cradling her abdomen as she lovingly keeps the baby protected from the world by bottling it up inside. Whereas in indexical, we see a pacifier. This can signify a few things. It could mean that the baby has been born. and it hints that potentially it dropped the pacifier as it was being carried. It could also mean that the baby is now older and no longer needs the pacifier. No matter the change, the student wanted to make sure that there were clues to hint that the mother, of course, loved the baby. The student did this by playing with the color and type placement. Look at the warmness of the red. It relates back to the love, while the position and placement of the type continues to follow the shape of the mother's body as we go from each poster. If you look, you can see that the first two lines of the type are aligned close to the mother's heart, whereas the last line is by her abdomen. Therefore, tying the entire meaning of the series together. Finally, we return to a student using lyrics for her semiotic poster series. Planet Earth is blue and there's nothing I can do, by David Bowie. Symbolic is represented using written word, but for iconic, since it mentions Earth, it made sense for the student to show the world. For indexical, the student opted to show an astronaut who appears to be floating in space. No longer is the Earth seen, just blackness. It hints that the astronaut could be lost in space or is potentially helpless. We think this because we do not see a space shuttle, nor a tether anchoring the astronaut to an object. Now that we reviewed a few semiotic poster examples, let's return to the arrow. At the start of the presentation, we stated that the arrow is a symbol that we are familiar with. The context in which it is used will determine if it's symbolic, iconic, or indexical. Let's see how the arrow is used in design. My students are assigned a recipe project. They are required to diagram a step-by-step process for making a certain item. Usually a recipe, whether it be a bread, whether it be a dessert, or if it be a pizza. They were not allowed to use written instructions. However, they could use an alphanumeric system and icons. What we see here is a student chose to make the pizza braid. On the left are the ingredients and materials needed to make this item. To the right of that are all the instructions to guide a viewer through the process from start to finish. If we look closely, we can see that the student has chosen to use arrows to aid the viewer as they attempt to make a pizza braid. Step 2 in particular, highlighted by a red box, shows the arrows depicting motion as they guide the viewer to open the canister of pre-made dough. The arrow becomes part of the student's iconic system as it reappears again in steps 3, 4, and 6. They're iconic because everything in here looks like what it represents. Another project where my students found arrows to be a useful tool for communication was in regards to wayfinding. In teams, students had to redesign the wayfinding system to guide people from the exterior of the ASU Art Museum to the entrance. Let's look at what two teams created. The first team used arrowheads stacked on one another to provide a directional feel for the viewer. This was in order to help guide people to the proper area. While these arrows do not look like a typical arrow, so not necessarily being iconic, they are symbolic, and that is what makes them familiar to the user. It is also how the user is able to interpret the message that the arrows are trying to provide. If we look at each photo, we can see that the arrows are repurposed for different uses. In the first photo on the left, we see the arrows are used in conjunction with words, so there's that symbolic representation. In the middle, it's just the arrows on a pillar. And on the far right, we see the arrows represented as a super graphic on the steps as one would see if they descended the stairs to the entrance of the museum. Here's another team solution. They took inspiration from the architecture of the art museum. They noticed that small clusters of squares are present throughout. The students realized that when aligned, they connect and create an arrowhead shape. They use this shape to produce a wayfinding system where the letter forms are exaggerated and the corner of each letter contains a directional arrow. You can see in this E for elevator that the bottom left has been turned into a directional arrow. It is gray to help show some difference from the letter form, and ideally it would be illuminated. While student projects make use of semiotics, particularly with the arrow, it isn't a new concept. This has been done for centuries. Let's take a look at historic information design pieces from the 19th century. In 1831, William Willis created a map depicting British vessels ordered to attack Falmouth, Maine. We can see the city and its ports. At the bottom are ships. But if you look at the ship on the left, just above it, there is an arrow. This arrow points to the ports where the ships will direct their assault. This arrow also looks very much like the arrows that we see from archery. Therefore, it takes on an iconic representation. I've highlighted it with a red rectangle so you can see the detail. Also, there is a crossbar on the arrow, which makes it feel somewhat like a compass and potentially provides cardinal direction. In 1854, Edward Umis created a floral and fauna impact and interaction illustration to show what happens in the atmosphere. Arrows move, some from right to left, others from left to right, to show how elements enter and exit the air. The top half of the graph shows the arrows as they fly up and down through the atmosphere just above the illustrated farm below. With them are symbols that help to carry and tell the user or viewer what is being carried. One of the most famous historic information designs created was brought to us by John Snow in 1854. Here we see his famous cholera map. It was created to identify which water pumps were infected and spreading the illness. We see that he added an arrow for directional reference. This helps people to understand what streets and what areas are infected. While the arrow is simple, there's no mistaking its meaning as it supports the information telling of the map. In 1856, Charles Joseph Menard produced a diagram that depicts the before and after shift of a bridge that is going to collapse. If we take a closer look, we see the arrow highlights the foundation where the sinking is occurring. Also, look at the type of arrow. Thus far, we have seen different arrows represented for each information design piece. Yet we continue to understand and recognize the arrow and its meaning, no matter if it's symbolic, iconic, or indexical. In 1862, Alvin Johnson created a diagram that displays the differences in time around the world. It doesn't seem that there are arrows present, but let's take a closer look. When we zoom in, we see that long, thin arrows are connected They show the various times of countries, states, and cities in reference to the clock at the center. Finally, in 1878, Edward Muybridge designed a diagram that identifies the directional flow and pattern of a horse's footing. While the quality of the diagram may not be the best, let's zoom in to see where the arrows are used to indicate where a horse places its hooves as it runs. The arrows highlight various points along a path of the horse's movements. They indicate the fore and hind foot as the horse makes contact with the ground. We've just observed how 19th century designers used the arrow to aid their works. Let's look at how modern designers have incorporated the arrow into some well-known brands. Founded in 1971 as Federal Express, it was based out of Memphis, Tennessee, USA, and has become an import-export delivery company that eventually changed its name to FedEx in 1973. The logo has changed from what was once a blue and red and white design to what you see here. This was created in 1994 by Linden Leader and Landor Associates. They sought to create simplicity and clarity in design. Look closely at the white space between the E and X. You can see a white, right-facing arrow. The hidden arrow represents speed and accuracy. In addition to that, it indexically represents what the company does. They move letters, boxes, and freight. This is considered one of the most successful and celebrated logos out there. Amazon. They were founded in 1994 in Seattle, Washington, USA. Initially, Amazon solely sold books before evolving into an online commerce site. The smile logo was designed by Turner Duckworth. If you look at this arrow, you see that it connects the A and the Z. This was done on purpose. They wanted the message that said they sell everything from A to Z. So there is a directional movement represented. But that's not all that this logo does. It also represents a smile. The smile that customers would experience by shopping their website. They wisely used the smile, this indexical clue of their company, and placed it as a marketing tool on their boxes. In a clever way, they say, quote, delivering smiles to doors, end quote. This is indexical, but also has an emotional feeling. Subway. Founded in 1965 as Pete's Super Submarines, it was later renamed in 1968 to what we know it as today. This fast food restaurant franchise serves sandwiches and salads worldwide. The arrow design has changed over the years. However, in 2016, it was revised to its current state. A minimalistic representation of the company with two colors and the two arrows. According to the company, they say, quote, the arrows denote an essential quality of the franchise that you can have a sandwich on the go with ease, end quote. Clearly, this is referencing the directional movement. Additionally, they go on to say that the logo serves to promote the idea of movement, motion, but also to convey speed, and they also want to say that it's quick and convenient, while still remaining fresh and healthy. If we look at the symbol for Subway, we see the same two arrows from the logo, only now we see them stacked. What's interesting about this is by stacking them, you can now see that in the center there is a white S. This ties back to the company name of Subway. It's a unique and fun way to play with their logo, but also is reminiscent of what we saw with FedEx and their white arrow. Despite its rudimentary beginnings, the arrow has been adopted to tell a larger story, and that is due to semiotics. The study of signs allows designers to understand how people create meaning and respond to it. This is what enhances our visual communication abilities. It is clear that semiotics has left an indelible mark on visual communication design. Today, we've seen how an arrow, something so simple and accepted worldwide, provides context for various situations. Whether it be used as a symbol, an icon, or have an indexical reference, the arrow reminds us that signs, when used effectively, can leave a lasting impression. Thank you for your time today.